Hello, and thank you for tuning in for another episode of Parenting Pickup. I'm Kara Johnson-Bader, your host. This month, we are absolutely honored to be joined at our home studio by MiaLisa Millares, Executive Director at Doing Good Together. She holds a master's degree in peace education from Columbia University Teachers College and is a Juris Doctor from Hamlin Mitchell, with a background in mediation and restorative practices. She has joined us in the past for our episodes on raising caring children and listening. MiaLisa is here today to discuss how to navigate difficult conversations and questions with children. Welcome, MiaLisa.
Thanks so much for having me, Kara. It's nice to see you again. It's been a while, actually, since I've been here in the studio, and it's really fun to do these conversations with you. So thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. We're thrilled to have you. Can you tell us how you ended up getting involved with Doing Good Together, education and nonprofit family support space?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background's kind of a little unusual. Actually, I come from kind of a long line of teachers. My parents were teachers. My aunts and uncles are mostly teachers. And so as a part of their work, I was often brought into school with them. And so I started volunteering at a really young age, helping out with their programs. See, they taught music and art, so it was always a really engaging kind of place to be. And I started doing volunteering then. And I think that's where I got my love for volunteering. And so then I became a teacher myself and worked a bit with elementary schools and taught. And I tried a number of different careers, but really found that the piece that I liked best was helping people through difficult conversations. I worked as a mediator and restorative practitioner for about a decade. And I worked as a trainer and a mentor. And I've worked with a lot of school programs doing that kind of work and helping people. I really built up a lot of emotional kind of knowledge, the social emotional learning kind of piece. And I've also worked 15 years leading children and youth programming in faith communities. And so when I saw the position open up at Doing Good Together for executive director, I thought it would really tie together all of these different interests and really just be a perfect niche for me. Let me do some teaching and some curriculum development and some mentoring and working with families, and what a perfect fit. It's really been a pleasure.
Well, it sounds like a great fit, as you said, because with your robust experience and education and expertise, it's a really nice blend, and it fits well with our topic of having difficult conversation, because it seems like with the current kind of information economy, the polarization of conversations around difficult topics, and the inopportune nature of kids' curiosity, positions and perspectives like yours are increasingly helpful. We know families will be delighted to hear from you to give them guidance, because it's hard to have those difficult conversations. It's nice to have you here to help us with that. So I'll just have you kind of tell us a little bit about your work at Doing Good Together.
Well, Doing Good Together has the mission of empowering families to raise kids who care and contribute. And we really have 4 basic programs. The first program is really about parenting with purpose. We have all kinds of resources for parents to really be big-hearted families, to be able to engage with their kids in good conversations, in good reading, and just do some wonderful activities and service projects together. And so in that particular portal, you'll see on our webpage just wonderful resources. If you click on the Parenting with Purpose tab, you'll see book lists about things like emotional awareness or mindfulness or gratitude. You'll see conversation starters. You'll see a whole list of projects that you can do with kind of found objects in your own house to do good for the community. And you'll find reflection materials and activities to do with your kids as well, which I think is just a really nice way to tie it all together. And we send out a newsletter, actually, that you can subscribe to for free that just kind of ties to each of these areas in kind of a specific way. So each month we'll have a different theme in the newsletter to try to draw attention to different resources that we have. We also have a program doing volunteering. So we have programs in about 10 different cities where we amplify other nonprofits' volunteer opportunities, and they're really curated specifically to be for parents with kids from about the ages of 3 through 12. Because it's easy to find volunteering opportunities, but it's really hard to find opportunities you can go and volunteer with your kids. And so we curate that list. So in the Twin Cities, you can find a great list of opportunities, the 10 to 15 or so each month, with lots of wraparound resources from that first program to be able to reflect on that opportunity with your kids afterwards. Because we know the learning actually takes place in multiple stages, right? There's the learning, the kinesthetic learning of actually doing some volunteering, and then there's the reflection afterwards. Our third program is the Family Service Fair program. And in that program, we usually set up a large space with several different opportunities for families to give back. And kids go from station to station learning about different nonprofits and doing a craft-like project that benefits the nonprofit. So for example, if we were talking about unhoused individuals, we might have personal care kits where the kids could pack personal care kits and write sweet messages of support to people who are going through some hard times. And then maybe another station might be for animals and making some toys for animals, and kids just love that. We try to really vary the stations because just like adults, kids find that they're interested in specific things, and so we want to give them a potpourri of options and ways to give back so that parents and kids can explore what's really interesting to them. And then our last program is just membership. We have a family membership and a classroom membership.
That's outstanding. There are so many resources for families, which I think as families, we're always looking for ways that we can help our children learn and grow and find ways to involve them in helping others. So what a fabulous organization doing incredible things for children and their families. So thank you for sharing all of that. I want to kind of jump into like our main topic about what are examples of reoccurring tough conversations you see with kind of toddlers, preschoolers, and pre-K children.
Thanks for asking, Kara. There's a number of different conversations that I kind of hear over and over again, and so I'll just highlight a few of them. But I think one of the ones that I hear the most, especially with that younger age range, is that families have trouble having conversations with kids because toddlers say no so affirmatively, so all the time, right? And I think that when I hear that, what I like to think about is how often the little ones in our lives hear no themselves, right? I mean, you have to think that at 2 years old, we're constantly setting boundaries for them on a regular basis, right? So it's not unusual or unlikely that they would start saying no themselves, right? It's also a developmental stage, right? There's this owning kind of what you want to do and developing agency. And so there's a piece of it too that we have these young people who are strong-willed, right? My youngest daughter is just a wonderful child. She's also very strong-willed. And if I'm able to kind of nurture that and get through these kind of early on years, right, with those strong affirmative no's, I think it can be a really wonderful skill to be so willful. As an adult, it's challenging when we have them as a toddler and they're giving us those strong no's. So I have a few strategies that have worked really well for this kind of thing. So one of them is, of course, offering choices, right? So shifting the conversation as a parent. Instead of saying, I need you to do this, giving some options that gives them some agency, which is really what they want, right? You can do this or that. You can have eggs for breakfast or you can have oatmeal for breakfast. Which would you prefer? And so it gives kids some power in the conversation, and I think that sometimes helps. Now, to be clear, it doesn't always help. There will be the child that says, I don't want eggs and I don't want oatmeal. But I think it's a good place to start. So that's one strategy, kind of offering some options and some choices. I think another one is to kind of reframe the way that we're talking about specific situations. So, for example, if you have a child who's at the park, right, and they're playing at the park, and you're going to tell them that it's time to go. Now, you've had it in your planner. Probably you had a block of time set for when you were going to start and when you were going to leave, and they don't have a great sense of time. So, of course, giving them some warnings is super helpful. Hey, we're going to be leaving in about 10 minutes or 5 minutes, or even a few of those along the way. But sometimes reframing the conversation again so that it's not, it's time to go, but hey, did you have a great time at the park today? Would you like to come back again? Because you can do your favorite thing 3 more times, and now we're going to go do this again next week and it'll be wonderful. And by reframing that from a negative to a positive, I think sometimes it helps our toddlers get their mind around what we're doing. That's a hard skill to do because in real time, it's so much easier to say, it's time to go now. But remember how much you dislike when someone interrupts you when you're working and how you need to finish your train of thought. Give the same respect to your toddler because they're becoming their own little person and they need that sort of opportunity to shift as well. And I think the third one would be just to kind of take a moment when you hear that no and just pause. Sometimes the power of a pause is so incredibly helpful and important for little ones because it lets them kind of wrap their brain around what you're asking. And sometimes they don't actually mean no. Sometimes they'll say no, stomp their foot, think about it for a minute, and then come and do what you're asking. So the second kind of situation that I've kind of heard about a lot is toddlers having trouble sharing. And that's a really tough one. I think, again, this can be helped with conversations on the front end of the sharing, right? So preparing your toddler for having someone come over and sharing their toys. Sometimes we forget that that's kind of a newer opportunity for young toddlers to experience and that they maybe haven't had someone taking and borrowing their toys and trying to work with them. And so that's kind of a new thing for them. So reminding them that so-and-so is coming over and that we're going to be sharing our toys. Is there anything here that maybe would be really hard to share? And giving them, again, some agency to say, well, my special ducky is something that I really am going to have trouble sharing. Okay, well, let's put that up in your room so that that's not a concern. But we're going to be sharing the other toys. Take another look because when they come, you set that expectation ahead of time so that they have an opportunity to really work with it. And I think by laying the groundwork, it really helps our toddlers prepare themselves for what's coming up. So again, these are conversations that don't necessarily help you on the flip side of the situation, right? But they do help prepare the kids to have a really successful interaction. And I think when we have toddlers, that's part of what it's all about, that successful interaction. And let me tell you, there will still be meltdowns, Kara. I mean, meltdowns are a part of our toddlers' world, right? They're still really young, their brains are still developing, and it's really hard when they don't have all those executive functioning skills. And so meltdowns are going to be a part of what you're going to experience when you have a toddler. And so I think when those situations arise, just taking some time again to change the environment that you're in. I have found that when I have a toddler who's melting down, sometimes just saying, it sounds like you're having a really hard time. Why don't we go for a walk outside? It is amazing how nature can totally shift your perspective and just make you feel a little better. And sometimes you can come back inside and have a conversation about it after the fact, and it's much, much better. I never talk about the situation in the moment of the meltdown because our little brains are not able to do that. They're not able to have that conversation. They're still so upset. I think acknowledging where they are and saying, I can tell that you're really upset right now. Let's just take a few breaths, right? And I've been doing that with my kids since they were little, and now sometimes they will just go grab the breathing ball. There's a little breathing ball that I have that kind of expands and contracts, and they'll just grab the breathing ball and take a few breaths on their own, and I know, okay, something's not going so well, but they'll take that and they've used that to help self-regulate. So I think when you lay that expectation of like, hey, we're going to allow you that space to take some time to breathe, to change the environment, to wait to have the conversation that we as adults feel is so imminent, that it really helps our toddlers out. So those are the conversations I hear the most from families.
Just thinking about giving children choices and working on reframing and allowing them some agency and teaching them strategies so that they learn how, like your children have, to be able to just take a moment and realize I need to breathe. I think as adults, we would benefit from that. There are times, I know my spouse, we probably just need a moment before we continue our conversation if it's not headed in the right direction. And it sounds like just being kind of proactive and offering these skills at a young age really will help everyone be more successful as they're walking through these kind of difficult conversations and navigate them much better.
I think you're right, Kara, and I think it's a skill for all of us. You know, those breaths that the young people are taking, it's great as a parent to stop and take breaths too, because sometimes when you have a little person who is having a meltdown and screaming at you, you need to take a breath because all of a sudden you need to remember, hey, they are a toddler. I am the adult in the situation here, but sometimes you need a moment as well. And boy, does oxygen help that situation.
Most definitely. I think that just a deep breath in between, because it's true. I mean, when you're toddlers, especially with the no's, and your point about that they hear no a lot, so they say no a lot, I think is really an important thing for us as parents to just stop and think about for a moment, because we spend a lot of time, I think, saying you need to be here, you need to do that, you can't cross the street by yourself, you have to do this, and they hear all those no's. And so just taking the time to realize they hear no a lot and realizing that there are times we just need to take a pause ourselves, because I think sometimes if we don't do that, we escalate the challenge and make it more challenging and kind of heighten the whole conversation instead of de-escalating and helping add the calm.
Right. And I think it's important to remember too that it doesn't always work right away. You have to give some of these techniques some time to kind of work, because it might not be the first time that you try to breathe with your child that they do what you say to do, right? It might not be the first time, but you might see that after 10 times or 20 times or a month of trying something, that you'll see the benefits and the fruits of your labor. So I like to mention that because I think sometimes parents hear a technique and try it once and say, that didn't work. And you have to give these things a little bit more than a, one sort of try. It's something that you're teaching them, a life skill, really. And it's something, like you said, that can be useful throughout your years.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think it's very true as parents. We hear a technique and we're like, oh, I'll try that. And then you do it and you're like, well, works for them, doesn't work for us. But like anything, it takes more than once to make sure that something clicks and that it works. And there isn't one right way to do something, but just really kind of being dedicated to it and trying it time and time again. And I think, too, if our children see us role modeling the taking a deep breath, that could be really helpful. And they might just learn that from seeing us do it. But I think that is super helpful for parents, just to have that point of like, try again. What about preschoolers? What tips do you have for preschoolers and pre-K in terms of the difficult conversation?
So, Kara, I think you can use these same techniques that I'm talking about with toddlers, with preschoolers as well. They're just a little bit older. They have a little bit more sophistication with how they go about their day and everything, and they might be even more affirmative with their no. They might give you a little foot stomp as well. But I think that if you're able to use some of these techniques of strategizing and really reframing conversations, it still helps the preschoolers. And, I even use this into elementary school as well, some of these techniques when I have kids that have meltdowns or things like that.
Perfect. I think those work all the way from toddlers through adulthood. I think we could all benefit from these techniques. So thank you. One thing I think that will always be a tough conversation is explaining kind of that grief or death in the family or death of a pet. How might an adult go about kind of tackling these topics with their young children?
That's a big question, Kara. And I want to just state that I'm not a grief expert, so I do want to just throw that out there. But I do have some ideas about how these conversations can go that I think could be helpful. I think there's a few categories that you mentioned there. You talked a little bit about the loss of someone you know personally, which is obviously a quite more dense question, right, than the other pieces. There's, of course, grief and death in general, and then there's grief and death in the world, right? So there's kind of categories that become increasingly expansive, if you will. I think the pieces that I would say that the common thread through all of it is, first of all, be compassionate and be empathetic with what you're talking about. Come to it with some preparation and some thought behind it if you can. Always be willing to be there for the child and comfort them through the conversation. And depending on who the child is and what the situation is, you have to kind of play that by ear a little bit, knowing the child and the situation and what that looks like. But comfort the child, be there for them. and then follow their lead. I think that's the best advice that I can probably give, because I think it's important that when kids are talking about death and grief, they may have some questions, but the questions become increasingly more complex as they get older, is what typically happens. And so when they come to you with this question, you have this idea that it's this amazingly huge question and you have so many things to tell them. But listen to really what they're asking and follow their lead, because they may just have a small question. And you can answer that small question and ask them, what is it that you know? What is it that you need to know, right? And then answer directly the question that they've posed to you. And that you may find that they'll actually come back to the topic several weeks later or several months later or even years later and refer to that very conversation or follow up on the conversation, asking for more details and more information when they are ready. So I think, and this is really most specifically for grief and death in general and grief and death in the world, right? I think you have a little less flexibility when it's loss of someone that you know personally, because sometimes that needs to be talked about at that moment in that time. And so that requires extra sensitivity. But I think be careful to know that you don't have to give them all the details of really big world events. You don't have to give them all the details of grief and death in the world, but stick to the question that they ask. Listen to what they're saying and try to answer what you can as honestly as you can in a kid-friendly way. And then, of course, be there to comfort them.
Those are all really incredible tips. Just thinking about, I think, when a child approaches me about something like that, I immediately want to give them all the information. But your advice of kind of stopping and meeting them where they're at makes it more meaningful and probably not as overwhelming if you're telling them things that they really may not even understand or care about. So really meeting them where they're at and thinking about and answering the question they want is really great advice for parents, because those are really difficult conversations.
They are, and you'll get better and better at having them and grow with them as their questions get more complex, which I think is one of the beautiful things about raising a child.
Most definitely. Are there tough conversations that you're having now that you didn't when you started this work? Or are there any other conversations that you find families needing to navigate more than they used to?
So that's a really interesting question. So the work that I used to do was much more in the mediation kind of context, right? And there were more interpersonal conversations, and I was asking questions and helping kids or parents through conversations that they were really running. It was their conversation. This is a little bit of a different kind of animal that I'm doing here at Doing Good Together. And so in the work of Doing Good Together, now I'm really preparing parents to have conversations around big topics with their kids and preparing them with other activities like empathy building exercises and providing book lists and conversation starters to help guide some of those conversations so that they can even preempt some of these topics and introduce some topics that maybe they've been trying to or want to have a good conversation with their kids about, a values-based conversation, but maybe just didn't have the framework to do it. And I think books are such a beautiful way to do that because kids engage with them really well. They really connect with the pictures, especially at this younger toddler, preschool sort of age. They just love picture books. And it opens up some new ideas for them where they can contextualize it a little bit differently. And it really helps parents to be able to have a conversation about a really concrete situation, right? And then be able to draw it kind of to the world. So you kind of have that skill of giving like a text to world kind of example, which is really exciting and also a great way to have good conversations with your kids. So I think that I've been thinking more in recent years about preparing parents to have these conversations in meaningful ways and how to get kids to build up that empathetic muscle that they have, right? That empathy I think of as a muscle, something that we have to practice and really work on. And it's something that developmentally isn't fully developed for quite a while. So it's something that they have time to really grow with. And so that's really my purpose here in Doing Good Together, to build that empathy muscle and prepare parents.
I love that. Thinking about empathy as a muscle that we grow and develop, and that your work at doing good together, you and your team are providing resources and tools to help families navigate these challenging conversations, but then also giving them resources such as books and other things to help them build that empathy muscle, which is wonderful.
Thanks. Thanks. We love the work that we're doing and are glad to put it out there for parents. And I can say that my staff has created so many of these exciting kinds of resources and tools, and I use them with my family as well because they're so good. So I can brag on them without without reservation.
That's fantastic. Before we jump into parenting questions, we'll have a word from our sponsor.
At New Horizon Academy, we know that you want the best for your child, and so do we. As a family-owned childcare provider that has been serving families like yours for more than 50 years, we are proud to provide best-in-class care and education for infants, toddlers, preschoolers, and school-age children. Through research-based curriculum, social-emotional learning, physical movement, and nurturing care, we'll help your child prepare for kindergarten and beyond. Visit the New Horizon Academy website to learn more and schedule a tour today.
Our first question comes from Anthony, and Anthony says, "It seems that immediately after reading stories at bedtime, my son asks big, tough questions that I am ill-prepared to answer. What advice do you have to navigate and respond to those big questions?"
Oh, that's a classic one, Anthony, I would say. My kids do too. They ask big, tough questions at bedtime. So you are not alone is the first thing that I would tell Anthony. I think that the biggest piece of those big, tough questions is you as a parent have to discern what needs to be answered right in the moment and if the question can actually wait. And if you're feeling ill-prepared to answer the question, then perhaps it's one that can wait a bit until you feel a bit more prepared, especially if it's big and tough. And that there's nothing wrong with saying to your kiddo, you know what? I'd love to answer that question for you, and I'd like to have enough time to have a really meaningful conversation about what you just asked. Perhaps we can chat about that tomorrow, and I'd love to carve out some time during the day to do that. And so I think that it's really important to come to those conversations with some preparedness. And so, Anthony, if you're not feeling prepared to have that conversation, take that extra time to have the conversation perhaps the next day, and take some time for yourself before the conversation to really take a few breaths. You can tell I've mentioned that a couple times in this podcast. I'm a big believer in breathing and the importance of it. So take some breaths or sit out in nature or whatever it is that you need to do to feel prepared to go into something that might be a little bit challenging. And then get your thoughts together so that you're able to have that conversation. And I think the same thing that I mentioned about the grief conversation applies here as well. Follow the young person's lead, because these big, tough conversations sometimes are big and tough because we put in there, how am I going to tell them everything about this topic? And you assume that the young person wants to know everything. And so really follow their lead. I can't say that enough. And give yourself the grace to have just a little extra time to prepare yourself and to have a really meaningful, good conversation. Because it's better to have that meaningful, good conversation the next day when you feel ready to have it and when you can help really answer their questions and guide their questions, than to rush it at bedtime when you're feeling ill-prepared. And so I think that's one of the things that I've learned as I have 3 kiddos, and in my first kiddo, you always kind of think, goodness, I need to answer that right in the moment. And by kiddo 3, we have a lot more, we'll talk about that in the morning. And then I always do. The big thing is to remember to follow up. I remember you wanted to talk about this topic. Or do you still have questions around that? And the same kind of thing. What do you know? What would you like to know? And that helps to really guide that conversation and let them take the lead.
I think that thoughtful and intentional approach will help the child feel heard, and it will result in a much better conversation than trying to answer a big question at bedtime and just quick get it out because we have to go to sleep in 30 seconds. because there's all these things we need to do and you need to go to bed. And so I think that really thoughtful and intentional approach will help a child feel heard, that my question is important, my dad wants to be able to answer it, and we're going to take more time tomorrow, which I think that's really incredibly helpful for families to just know it's okay to pause.
That pause is critical, I think, sometimes to help things go really smoothly, both for the young person and for yourself.
Great. We have another question from Jess. And Jess says, my daughter came home from school and asked what divorce is, why does it happen, and what will happen to her best friend. For context, her best friend's parents are going through the divorce process, and she's asking questions.
Jess, I would reassure your daughter that her best friend will always be kept at the center of that divorce process, in the sense that parents really want what's best for their child, and that both parents still love the child very, very much. And so I think it's really important that young people understand that kids are still loved through divorce, that it isn't really about the kids at all, and to just allow them to understand that there's lots of different structures of families, and that the family structure may be changing, but the love between all the parties, as far as the love for the young people, is still there and still really, really important and a part of the young person's life.
I do think that taking that thoughtful approach will really be helpful for a child who has someone they care deeply about is going through the divorce process. And it's an abstract concept to try to understand. So having your parent calmly kind of walk you through everything and really center everything and reassure and talk about how the child's at the center will help a young child kind of navigate that abstract concept.
And I think it also allows the child, who is now the support person for the other child, to be able to reassure them as well and say, there's lots of different types of families, and your family is still a family, and it gives them the words to be able to comfort the other child, and I think that's helpful too.
Absolutely. Our next question is from Francesca, and she says, my daughter is 4 years old, and her friends tend to have regular and ongoing spats, with one of them saying, you're not my friend anymore, and you can't come to my birthday party. How do you recommend I help my child through this challenging situation?
Oh, I would tell Francesca that take heart. This is something that kids have dealt with for years in the past and will probably deal with for years to come. But you're right, it does take some finessing to try to help get through this, and it can be a challenging conversation. One of the things that I do when I'm talking with my kids about something like this type of a situation is I encourage them to think about empathy. And I explain what empathy is, the idea of kind of flipping the situation around and how would you feel when. I also ask them to think a little bit about what started the spat, right? What started the conflict? How might they have been a part of starting the conflict? And the reason I ask that question is because I feel like most of the time when there's a conflict between kids, and I will exclude like serious bullying situations from this, but most of the time when it's a conflict between friends, there's something that one person did and there's something that the other person did, and both of them usually aren't being their best selves. Think about the conflicts you've been in your own life, and isn't that really true? Like someone says something to you and all of a sudden you respond abruptly, and maybe you were a little bit more abrupt or curt than you intended to be, and you weren't the best version of yourself, and they weren't the best version of themselves, and all of a sudden an ultimatum is put down, and you don't quite know how to get out of the situation. And so I would ask her to think a little bit about what she might have had, what role she might have had in the actual conversation, and what role her friend might have had in the conversation. And I would encourage her to have a second conversation with the child, thinking about that and talking about how, maybe I wasn't my best self when I did X, Y, and Z, whatever it is. And sometimes it's hard for the child to identify that, so kind of normalizing the fact that, mistakes happen, and we aren't always our best selves. And that doesn't just go for kids, it goes for adults too. I know I'm not always my best self. And sometimes acknowledging that to kids is really, it's a chance to really add some humility to the situation and to remind kids that we're not perfect as adults. We're humans and we're going to make mistakes, and we're just like them in that way. So I think that can really help, and hopefully they can resolve the situation on their own in that way. But if they can't, you as a parent and the other parent can also have a conversation to try to help along the situation. But if it gets to be an older kid, like a preschool kid, giving them the context to be able to say, I wasn't the best version of myself when I did this to their friend. And sometimes that'll give the courage for the other child to say the same thing. And so preparing that, role playing with your child to give them the strength to be able to try that out, and also giving them the sense that you don't know what the other person is going to say. But all we can do in a situation is be our best selves, own our own things, and try to move forward as much as possible.
That's fabulous. Just stopping to think about starting with that empathy piece and helping your child kind of look at their behavior and thinking about, did I bring my best self forward? Which is a difficult question to answer for us as adults and even for young children. But I think learning that technique at a young age will definitely aid in building relationships and really helping them grow and learn how to navigate some of those challenging conversations and things that happen in life. Is that it doesn't end in preschool. It continues throughout your whole life. So stopping to think, was I my best self, is incredibly helpful advice.
And sometimes with preschoolers too, preschoolers will say one thing one day and sometimes it will change the next day. And so just sparking a conversation might actually shift that little person just in the right way to be able to hopefully be able to find what's right for both of them as they move forward.
Absolutely. And I like the idea of parents role modeling that they're not perfect and that we as adults don't always bring our best selves to the conversations and sometimes can be reactive instead of really listening with intent to learn, or sometimes just responding, which is not always helpful, and responding sometimes not as thoughtfully as we should.
Yeah, when someone responds to me in a way that I just think is maybe harsh or abrupt, I'm trying to retrain myself as an adult to say, what's going on in their own life, right? Because it's not always what they intended to say, and sometimes we've had a tough morning, or, we've had a difficult month, or whatever it is, and we're bringing that to the situation. And I think that's important to remember. How does that impact us as adults? And then imagine that with a preschooler who has perhaps a little less executive functioning, right? Like, how does it affect a preschooler who has a little less experience? So
wonderful. Our final question comes from Dwayne, and Dwayne says, my son's dear friend is moving, and he's experiencing big emotions, and I'm not sure how to best help him. Please share advice on how to navigate this big milestone in their relationship.
Yeah, that's a great question, Dwayne. I think that it's really important for those emotions to be named and to be owned. And I think working through that with toddlers and preschoolers can be hard because they're learning how to use all these different emotions, and there's even some movies out right now about about all of that. So I think that there's some opportunities to have good conversations around emotions and how you're feeling, owning that. But I think it's also important to help add some context and to problem solve with your child, because moving today is a lot different than moving even 15 years ago. We now have all of these different techniques where we're able to have conversations with people on Zoom or FaceTime, and it's not really necessarily the end of a friendship if you don't want it to be. Moving can be a lot of a softer kind of exit, or a continued friendship through technology. And so I think being able to talk through those options that kids might not fully understand or might fully understand depending on how much knowledge they have of screens, you can help walk through those pieces and problem solve with your children. And sometimes that will also help with the emotional piece.
Fabulous. I think that is also helpful to think about, that the relationship doesn't have to end just because someone's moving away. There's still ways to stay connected. So wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining the Parenting Pickup podcast as our special guest, MiaLisa. I'm just so thrilled to have you here. You are so knowledgeable, and the information is critical for, I think, families to know. I think that they will be able to put the information you shared along with the resources available at Doing Good Together to great use. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be here.
If you would like more information on this episode or need access to the other resources mentioned, head to our website at newhorizonacademy.net. And if you have questions, please email us at parentingpickup@nhacademy.net. Thanks, and have a great day.